It's an enormous pleasure to welcome you here in our humble Berlin research hub of the Kiel Institute. It's not the mothership, it's the little ship here in Berlin that we use to host events and have conferences. And we're very delighted to have the Ludwig-Erhard-Forum here today in the fourth lecture of the series. And we just said we all enjoy the format because it's a little bit of a Wanderzirkus. They travel around to different institutions. So we meet, we talk, we build a network, and it's great. And I'm very grateful to Stefan Kolev, who will say a few words now, for having picked us and come here. And we'll do our best to be good hosts. And obviously, Cornelia, always so nice to see you and have pleasure to be with you and have you around. But Stefan is going to do that job of telling us about all the really, really amazing things that you have done and are doing. So we're very proud to also be a close partner of Hertie School. Okay, Stefan, floor is yours. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Here you go. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome to what is the fourth LEF Academy lecture. We have several events, but let me first say a couple of things about the Ludwig-Erhard-Forum, as you see it over there. When we met about 1.5 years ago, we were quite new. Meanwhile, I don't say we're new anymore. We are adolescent or something like that, right? So we are the Berlin branch of the Ludwig-Erhard Foundation, which is in Bonn and which is a traditional institution of the Bonn Republic. But as we know, things move to Berlin, as Moritz does with the Kiel Institute in some ways. And so that's what we also try to do. We were founded about 1.5 years ago, and we try to be basically two things. The one thing is a voice, the second thing is a platform. The voice tries to revitalize those old traditions of German political economy, ordoliberalism, social market economy in particular, which have become a little bit rusty and which need some new impulses, as you will see tonight, and as you can see also in other events we try to organize. And that platform does not necessarily include people who like us or who like that content. Actually, quite on the contrary, I believe that that tradition, or any intellectual tradition for that matter, can actually only develop further if it meets people who respect it but don't necessarily like it, right? So we do like intellectual exchange of any kind, and we very much believe that the center, the political center, which a week ago experienced quite a bit of an earthquake here in Berlin, but also, of course, in Washington, needs those dialogues, which we try to establish as a platform. So we are a voice. We try to publish things in the media. We try to publish papers. We just published our first policy paper by Markus Brunnermeier. We have a working paper series. So check out our website and try to join our small community. We have several event series. One is called a civilized provocation. So there we try to have a debating format of people who disagree and nevertheless try to strengthen the center. And we have the series which you attend tonight, which is called the LEF Academy lecture series. It started in the spring of 2023 when Christian Lindner was at Princeton. The second installment was Markus Brunnermeier last November at Humboldt University. The third was hosted at the Hertie School in May by Harold James. And luckily now we have Cornelia Woll for the fourth installment of our LEF Academy lecture series. Who is Cornelia Woll? She's the president of the Hertie School, which is a very important institution in Berlin. And I have to say that when we met, you told me and had also told the media that you had those two main goals: to make the school visible and to show that social science is important for our times. And I firmly believe it's not a compliment that you have succeeded in both. I think the Hertie School has become a place to be if you're interested in governance in Berlin. And it does show that social science matter. Social sciences in plural matter, including economics, but not only. And I really, really congratulate you for the recent coup of giving an honorary degree to Arnold Schwarzenegger, because also those events show that governance, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight, is quite a big thing. And many people have to say interesting things about that in the crazy times we live in. Cornelia has a degree from Chicago, then from Cologne, PhD from Cologne, habilitation from Bremen. Before coming to Berlin, she was in Paris at Sciences Po. And has a research agenda which really is a perfect fit to what we try to represent in Berlin, because it is about international political economy, but it really, really, really addresses the whole agenda of the social market economy of neoliberalism, being power, entanglement of political and economic power, the interface of law and economics, international issues which obviously have become as pressing as they have never been, even more so since last week. With that, I will pass on to you. I want to thank Moritz once again, because the two of you have really become the leading voices of geoeconomics. So I'm really, really, really happy that this old tradition of neoliberalism, which was always somewhat German and somewhat national, can be thought and developed in an international context at a superb research institute like the Kiel Institute, and with new international governance tools and methods like the ones you use in your books and publications. Thank you for being with us. Hi, Kerstin, and the floor is yours.
And I need a photo of both of you together.
Wonderful, yes.
Otherwise, yeah. Thanks, Stefan.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for having us and for the introduction. Stefan, thank you very much also for the very kind introduction. I should out myself. You said to speak here, one doesn't have to be a friend of the Ludwig-Erhard-Forum. I am a friend, and I very much like you.
And a member of the Ludwig-Erhard
And I'm even a member of the Ludwig-Erhard Foundation. And I have to say that what I really think unites the three of us, but also makes me want to be part of this particular endeavor and speak here today, is that I've always had a passion for the intersection between economics and politics. I think there are a lot of things that economists do much better than I would. I'm a political scientist, but what I find interesting is that the economy and the way in which the economy also is way beyond just the nation state, a global connected network, has a lot of political consequences that we need to study. And that's what I want to contribute here today. But I do think that this old tradition of political economy, when people say political economy, they usually mean one of 5 different things, and you never quite know which one it is. So to me, that intersection between the political and the economic questions is really something I'm passionate about, and that I think you do well. And Moritz, I don't even have to advertise all the things you do, but I'm very happy to have that exchange with you. So the title of the talk that I wanted to give today, Corporate Crime and Punishment: Who Should Police Global Companies and Why and How? I'm not even sure I gave it, but the first part of it is the title of a book that I've published last year, and I want to tell you that story. And people don't understand what the book is about. I have tried 15 different pitches. I've tried 20 different titles. The book is, I'll tell you what it is about first, and then maybe draw you into it. It is a question of how the way companies circulate in the global economy makes them vulnerable, because they're part of an economic network, to becoming the target of what could be interstate conflict, war that is being carried out within companies and on companies, and sometimes through law. So it is a book about how law is used in the global economy on companies. I want to tell you the politics of it. I want to say a disclaimer first. Every time I say this, somebody in the room stands up and says, but the companies also have done evil things, and that's why they become a target. And the answer is yes. But I want to tell you a political story of how justice, and in this case, corporate criminal justice, is done in global markets, where really justice is a national thing, happens at the national level, and companies circulate globally. So that's the story I have. It's a story about the politics of global markets to a certain degree. And I want to tell you how things have changed in the last 20 years in ways that I do think are underappreciated. But it's a long story, which is why this is a book. When I started working on it, I said I can do an article, and then I realized I have 5 points to make. And people always tell you 1 article, 1 point to make. So I said, okay, fine, then I'll write a book with several chapters. And to a certain degree, I want you to come with me into a narrative of what I think is an important development to understand in the last 20 years in the Western world. Ask me questions about it, because it breaks down into several sub-pieces that I'm pretty sure I have expertise in the room, and people might or might not agree with me. But that's what we're here for. So what is my access, and how do I want to get into this? The first part that I think everybody who reads the newspapers can follow is that we see more and more headlines that seem to indicate that these big companies, multinational companies, are no longer in the sphere of impunity where they can do whatever they'd like. It's something that when I was in university was always an assumption. But you see very important fine settlements, court cases brought against well-known players here. Volkswagen, for example, Airbus, you see BP and oil spill that so part of movie history now, or banks, for example, being fined on various things. I'll get into, if anybody here in the room is a lawyer, by the way, I have to say, please bear with me. I know you hate pretty much everything I say because I butcher categories that it's important to legal scholars. At the end, you might understand why I'm doing it, but bear with me. I know it's a bit painful when it's actually your field. But there's a lot of different fees that in certain cases concern criminal fines, in certain cases not. But you see this and you think, aha. So we used to think a multinational company could just travel around the world, and if they are prosecuted in one country, well, they relocate to another country, they do regulatory arbitrage, they get out of it. There is this world of corporate impunity. Nobody can get to these big corporations, and here we see them paying billions. So my first question, or the puzzle that I have, is what happened? Why are we no longer in a space where corporations seem to be able to get away with it? And that is relevant because 1990s, for the older ones who might remember discussions at the time, said companies basically can get away with misconduct because they can do arbitrage between different national systems. They have structural power. You don't want to strike down a company when jobs are at risk, when economic growth is at risk. So people use them only with soft gloves, and that explains why it is harder for companies of real importance to be brought to court, to make it very simple. And then the question is, why is that no longer the case? And the story I write in my book provides an answer. And the answer I have is twofold. There's an empirical argument if you're actually working in the field, and then there's a theoretical argument. Let me start with the empirical argument first. The empirical argument focuses on the United States and tries to show that in the United States, something happened in corporate criminal law, which is proper just to the US, which led basically the Department of Justice to move away from court, prosecution in court, trials, and to something that I will summarize here as negotiated justice. It's very specific instruments where you try to reach a settlement that you negotiate. And that is because a prosecutor, when giving a negotiation space, can tell the company, you have to be part of an internal investigation. So rather than bringing you to court and having to prove that you're guilty, we want to work together. We negotiate something. At the end of it may come a settlement. And that means maybe you're not even guilty, but you pay a couple of billions. And then we move on. But there's some sort of very big arrangement between the company and the prosecutor. And that is something that happened just in the US, and it's a story about basically corporate criminal law in the United States. But that had a lot of repercussions for the rest of the world. Why? Because what happens also, and that's something the legal profession is quite well aware of, is something called extraterritoriality. And that is the use of one's domestic law beyond one's territory, so beyond one's borders, by all sorts of means that mean that even though I have a jurisdiction over my territory, if I'm the Department of Justice, I can actually create an effective jurisdiction and prosecute a company that may be in Switzerland, may be French, for business that they do with Iran. And this extraterritorial application of domestic US law has also grown over the last 20 years quite significantly for a number of reasons I'll show you. And that means that the legal reach the US has over companies has grown really in importance, and that created a conundrum or a bit of an embarrassment for the governments everywhere in the world, because their companies, Volkswagen, the emission scandal, which I think we can all agree on is a bad thing, was not prosecuted in Germany. It was the Environmental Protection Agency in the US that brought this case. And then all of a sudden, the German authorities have to answer for why they didn't investigate further these type of issues and why they seem to have looked the other way. It's the same in almost every country. When your companies are on the line and embroiled in legal battles that are prosecuted by a different government, you have to answer why you were looking away and why you're not able to be tough on your own companies. So that then means you have to say, well, what are they being prosecuted over? If it's domestic law, to a certain degree, a government can say, I want my legal sovereignty back. It was legal in my country. It was legal in Switzerland. It's legal according to French law. Why is the Department of Justice coming in? So you have a clash between the different national domestic settings, or you have a clash between different sectoral settings. And that means the more and more you actually want to move forward, the more you have to harmonize the norms you apply and also the tools you have. And so out of this US-focused change in corporate criminal prosecution, and with it extraterritoriality, it triggered institutional change in a lot of different countries in, roughly saying, the Western world, to which I count, for example, Japan. So bear with me, it's kind of like the Henry Farrell and Abe Newman call it the underground empire. So it basically means everybody connected to the US economic sphere had to adapt their legal institutions in this space in order to keep up to a development. And that's the story I want to show you. What happened in the US, how it moved across borders, and the change it triggered abroad in a number of countries, empirically. And the empirical story that I want to convince you of is that we see something that I call the rise of negotiated justice. This idea that you negotiate, that you have somebody prosecuting some criminal cases, you have basically a state or a public authority prosecuting misconduct, and you have somebody who's accused to be the suspect, who can negotiate what exactly it is that they will pay, do, or change in order to get out of these conversations, is something that is very common in common law countries where we have plea bargains, for example. Plea bargains are nothing else, but it is completely contrary to the sensitivity of somebody in a civil law country where there is right and wrong. You go to court and you prove whether you're right or you're wrong. You don't negotiate over it. So what we see through this mechanism that reaches across borders is that everywhere, whether it's common law or civil law tradition, we see a rise in negotiated corporate justice. And that's the story I'd like to tell you. Empirically, there's a theoretical argument that I'll run through quickly. It's interesting for the students in the room who do international political economy, but basically the fact that these extraterritorial use of domestic law is possible is rooted in market power and in market infrastructures. It's because people use the dollar. It's because they use data information systems and write emails on Gmail. It's because you can in certain cases be excluded from a domestic market, which in this case is the US or the New York Stock Exchange, that this works. So you have to have market power in order to even envision using this. The book I write has no insights for Luxembourg, even though they might find a couple of things interesting for how they're being viewed, but it's not, that's the basis of the development. It also makes an argument that I get a lot of pushback on, which is law can be used strategically, and it can be used in the interest of specific national economic objectives, or even military objectives, or something else. Most legal scholars are aware of this, but I think for us it is useful because back in the day, there was this idea that markets are this perfect mechanisms, just a price signal thing, and there's no politics behind it, and people have written a lot about this. Here it's a similar argument about the law. The law is not just a tool to distinguish right from wrong, but it can be used as a tool of power. And I'll show you some of the things that are happening here as well. And then there is a institutional change argument. Why do we see now that the legal systems in all of these other countries are adapting to something that they observe coming from the US across boundaries? And there's a whole discussion. Is it Americanization? Is it the fact that common law is more efficient? What happens exactly? And the argument I have here is a normative regime change argument. What happens is that law comes into your country and acts as an irritant. So you're not trying to copy the US, and most countries are not copying the US, but they have to respond to this irritation. So that's the institutional argument that I'm pretty sure nobody in the room cares for a lot, but it's in here. And that's why we see institutional change. Okay, let me walk you through the 4 different steps that I've just announced with some with some more detail. And I have to admit, I have no notion of time. So usually I talk, and you need to stop me because I see the small little clock, but I get excited of this and will not look at it. So do wave hands if I'm running over time. Let me first start with the section that is the changes in the US corporate criminal world. And that is something that I basically just take from those scholars who are an expert of it, because that's a specific area. I don't know who was old enough to remember Enron in this room, but Enron is one of the biggest corporate scandals that really shook the United States. And at the time where it came out and where there was a court case on this, what you actually saw was an outline where these are the two chiefs from Enron went to court for what was a corporate criminal activities. They basically cooked their books and made money disappear. And you had here a verdict where actually both of them were convicted to prison sentences of more than 25 years each. So this is back in the day what might have happened for very important corporate scandals. A similar one, I came into this research because I'd worked on the financial crisis and I was trying to answer the question, what happens to the banks that went bankrupt or that were possibly part of the illegal activities that were going on, the crooks, as some people say. What happened to them? And back I'll tell you what happened in the financial crisis in just a second, but prior to the financial crisis, there was a savings and loans crisis in the 1990s, and there were a lot of court cases against banks with a lot of personal convictions of management of these banks, including prison sentences. What happened after the financial crisis is this. So here you have Enron with the guilty verdict. This is something the New York Times did at the 10 years anniversary of the financial crisis, where they asked who are the CEOs of Wall Street that went to jail. And in an act of media protest, they left the page blank to say really nothing. We can go into the details because the answer is it's really 0.3%, and there are some court cases, but the big picture is still this. You could have had CEOs going to prison for 25 years, and this no longer happened, and we most recently saw this in the financial crisis. What we did see over this period, though, is a couple of things that changed. The first is it's not a suspense, but it's not that there is no corporate criminal activity anymore. So, or that everybody on Wall Street was completely innocent. But what happened in these cases, and Obama went on television saying, I have people with pitchforks wanting me to go after Wall Street. I promise you, everybody will be brought to account. So the Department of Justice was very eager to make sure they cleaned up, and they actually brought cases against those in Wall Street that may have been responsible for misconduct in the financial crisis. But what that led to were a lot of financial penalties, a lot of fees, a lot of also negotiated agreements. And the negotiated agreements in the US are called deferred prosecution settlements. So you threaten prosecution, but you don't actually prosecute. You try to settle instead of the prosecution, so you don't go to court. And with that came a decrease in the prosecution of individuals, management, also because for reasons that are very much linked to client lawyer privileges, it's very hard to do an internal investigation in a company when the people who have access to that information cannot speak about it. So there are very, very detailed US legal reasons for it, but to make it simple, it is very hard to bring a case against the corporations, very hard to bring a case against the management of these corporations and win it, which is why there was this move towards negotiated settlements, deferred prosecution settlements, and with it came a drop in individual prosecutions and a drop in prison sentences quite as much as well, for good or for bad reasons, but that is the general trend. And here is a database I've been working with a lot, just so you see it visually. The database I've been working with is an unusual database because you get a lot of databases that have court cases, but one person in particular, Brenton Garrett, brought together all type of prosecutions, whether they're tried in court or whether they're settled at the federal level. That makes it complicated because you can prosecute things also in New York, for example, and then it might not be in this case, but generally we would assume that very big cases are all at the federal level. And what you can see if you look at just the federal level type of cases, whether they're settlements or tried in court, is that we see an increase in the fines And this is a scale that has billions. So you see more and more billions being paid in fines for a number of cases that was rather stable or even dropping. Fun fact, since we just lived through the US election, this is the Trump government. So one thing about how this is used in a political way, what I'm personally interested in is when does somebody bring a case, of course, but also when does somebody decide not to bring a case? And you always get a backlog. So I have certain cases that are in the machinery, and then, Department of Justice and especially prosecution is independent of government. So they would say, we're just pursuing justice. But if somebody and the Department of Justice can give an indication, don't be so tough on corporate crime, you can't see something like this. I'll not make a prediction of what will happen next, but just know that this does have a partisan taste to it as well. Okay, but you do see that more and more of these corporate prosecutions end up in settlements of higher and higher amounts for all sorts of activities. So it could be cartels, could be bank secrets, it could be fraud, foreign corruption, sanctions violations. Something often called export imports is, of course, the who still trades with Russia, who still trades with Iran, these kind of cases. All of that mixed together has increased in the number of fines companies had to pay. Now, the political or the geopolitical story I also want you to be aware of is this. So my database is the Department of Justice US federal level number of cases. And as one should expect, because criminal law is national, crime is always, you are an insult to the norms of the state and the country. So it is deeply national. And you would expect that the cases that are in the US database are US cases, and they are. They basically try to make sure that they prosecute their own companies, and then there are some foreign companies as well. But the fines are disproportionately by the small set of foreign companies here. So for a number will come on the next slide, for what I think is, 16% of the cases, we get over 55% of the fines that are being paid. Now, you're all good social scientists. This is just suggestive. I'm not making an argument. I don't even know if there's a bias, but you should be aware that the companies who have paid these fines in the US justice system are Siemens, Volkswagen, any Swiss bank you can probably think of, big companies, British Airways, etc., etc. So there is something going on here that I think is worthwhile explaining. My initial ambition was I'll write a book explaining just that. And then I dug into the data and I realized, like any person who works on crime, it's an impossible task, because in order to actually make an argument what this is about, we need to know what the objective number of all criminal activities is, and ideally how important the crime was in terms of money. And I got nowhere. Maybe somebody in the room can. But what I can say is that within the categories given by the data that I have, which is very poor, let me just talk about the limitations. Let me talk about the limitations of the data first before I show you this. For example, I do not know the size of the companies that pay this. If you are a very big bank, maybe paying 3 billion, is not a lot. And maybe it is very well justified by the amount of gain you get out of your financial activity. I know neither the gain of the financial activity nor the size of these individual companies. So that's hard to trace. What I do know is whether they are public or private. Private are privately held companies. Public companies are companies listed on the stock exchange. So we can control for a company that is listed on the stock exchange, and that means it's rather the bigger ones versus the privately held ones, which are more likely to be here. That's something we can control for, and we can control for not for the benefit of the crime, but the category of the crime. So we can look at, is it for the same type of financial fraud, two publicly listed companies, one being foreign and one being US, what difference do we see? And here we see that, first of all, the likelihood of being fined when you're a foreign company in the US is 14.8% higher. And the fines that these companies pay, if and when they pay, when you're a foreign company, will be 6.6 times larger. So whereas a US company may just pay 1 billion in fine, the US company, these things being equal, which is a very limited number of things, will be 6.6 times larger. That's as much as I can get out of the data. It's not sufficient, but it does two things. It confirms what every European company that has been embroiled in legal studies has told me they felt. They're paying more. They're being treated unequally. And it confirms also to a certain degree that at least, if I cannot entirely explain it, it is something that we need to look into. Why is it so much higher when there are foreign companies? And there are a lot of explanations. I'd actually love to engage in a discussion with you rather than telling you my favorite explanations, because I can already tell you I can't prove any of them, but I have my ideas. Now, what is interesting in this, I call it home market bias of corporate justice, is that it works through things that are part of the general story. And part of this is linked to the argument I want to build on extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality really is possible. So establishing an effective jurisdiction is possible because the market infrastructures that everybody needs in order to function allow to wield the power and use that stick, legal stick, in certain ways. And what are these infrastructures? On the first of all, it's secure. If you're listed on the stock market, if you're listed on the New York stock market, for example, you automatically have security regulation apply to you. That's one nexus. If you are making transactions in dollars, you have to use a settlement system. You use data. All of these things are the market infrastructure that is being used. One, they tie you to the authorities that regulate them in certain cases. And the other is also that it establishes a specific kind of nexus. I'll get to that. And the second, in these economically connected networks, what actually happens is that the country that wants to prosecute you has enforcement tools that it may not have had otherwise. If I can say I can exclude you from a market, you're much more likely to engage in negotiations than if I would just say, we think you breached whichever regulation might have. And so the fact that an authority can have prescriptive jurisdiction and market power means that they have effective jurisdiction. This is just one cartoon, because obviously after the financial crisis, it was also a lot of bonuses. But what I, other than the joke, want you to see here is that at that time for Credit Suisse, that was the Credit Suisse of 2014, for those of you who are following. But at that time, for Credit Suisse, the most important part was, of course, how much they would be paying, but can they maintain a banking license? Can they still operate in the US market? That was hugely important. And once they had these two things settled, they say, we saved what matters most. And no, it's not the bonuses. But for companies, that is important. And that gives the Department of Justice and the prosecutors negotiation power, because you can exclude somebody, for example, from a market. And these are the economic statecraft tools that political scientists can tell you a lot about, but exclusion is one of them. Now, the legal reach of the American law works differently in different areas. So some of you might be corruption experts. Some of you might work a lot on antitrust, for example, or on bribery or data. And in any one of these sectors, the nexus that can establish this extraterritorial reach is slightly different. In antitrust, it's always argued, as long as there's an impact on our domestic market, we have prescriptive jurisdiction over you, because you might not even be selling your bananas in the US market, but you can have an impact on the banana market in the US, and that gives you legal reach. This is just on antitrust, one of these things that we developed. Most people know foreign bribery quite well, and I can talk about that at length. A lot of the economic sanctions regimes works through settlements in dollars, which is why, I'll get to that in a second, one of the political answers was, well, let's try to invent a settlement system that doesn't even use the dollars if we want to have a foreign policy that is not dictated by the US and still trade with a country that another foreign country might want to trade with, but the US has a sanctions regime on it. So you get legal reach through different nexuses. That's already interesting, but to me, it's all the same as long as you get a mechanism to establish a nexus. But I do want you to just look at this little pie chart to give you certain ideas of what areas this is used in most. Where do we see the most important corporate either convictions or settlements? And here you see the number of cases on the outside of the circle and the amount of money that is spent, amount of fines is the size of the slice. So two interesting things. I mean, a lot of these cases are very big, very expensive antitrust cases. Same here with fraud. Fraud is huge. Import and export, I think today would be even larger, but this is the sanctions regimes. But I also find interesting what you don't see here. So maritime pollution, where is maritime pollution? Here. This is maritime pollution. There's 97 cases of maritime pollution because basically ships dump stuff in the oceans all the time. It's quite evident. They get prosecuted and convicted for it. Well, but not by a lot. So it's a small kind of thing. Here, this 18 actually refers to the green pie that you don't see. So we've brought 18, there's 18 cases of environmental fraud, kind of like Volkswagen or maybe others. And the amount, I mean, this is also the age of my data, but the amount back then is very few cases, not very expensive for the companies to commit environmental fraud. I'm saying this because a lot of people now also in the legal scholarship think about strategic litigation. When should you prosecute somebody and how do you get the state to their knees when they're violating the climate agreements, for example? I think people should look at what you can do with companies who do environmental fraud because it's really not used a lot, even though the tools technically would be the same. But that's just the parentheses, I'll close this off. It's just something that you come out of the data. It's not used everywhere, but it is used in a lot of these areas quite effectively. Now, that's what happened in the US and how the US is taking it through extraterritorial jurisdiction outward. And maybe one thing, I'm sorry, I have to make this clear again, just with reference to this chart. One thing that you should be very aware of is I'm coming now to an economic statecraft. So law is part of economic statecraft argument, but it's the economic statecraft you use with the friends, not with the enemies. And I think that's important because it's economic statecraft not to fight, I mean, I'll say something about Huawei in a second, but generally not to fight China or Russia. It is to get your friends in line with the national economic interests that you're trying to fight for. So the companies that are most affected by that are the ones that want to still be part of that economic network, but it makes them vulnerable to a certain degree to the squeeze that will happen between one government here, it's the US, say something about others who do it as well, and other governments, let's just say China or Russia. And that means they have to make sure that companies are in line with these national objectives, economic or security objectives. And that is the technique they have to make sure companies follow that national interest, their own companies and the companies of their friends. Okay, so let me get to economic statecraft. So most of you know the beautiful town of Sassnitz or have been to Rügen, where we created pipeline that is now forgotten that was going to go to Russia, Nord Stream, the whole Nord Stream project. If you look into it, it's a very fun case of how that works in practice, because here we have a case, I mean, probably all Germans are embarrassed about it now because we didn't listen to anybody and didn't listen to anybody in the European Union. We just said we want to build this thing, despite a lot of voices to the contrary. So I don't want to discuss the decision to build Nord Stream 2, but I want to show you how that was battled over, because it's a very typical case of one country here, Germany, let's just say Germany, maybe it's all of Europe, one saying we want to have a foreign policy approach, energy connections to Russia. And the US has always been up in arms against this. And there's back and forth of how exactly you can stop this thing, but the most important one was suing the companies that build it. Suing the companies that build it to a point where a lot of the vessels that lay these things in the ground moved away from the project because you can be sued out of existence quite easily. At the very end, it was only Russian vessels dropping this thing into the water so that there can only be a connection, because Russian vessels are not concerned about lawfare. This little letter here, written by the United States Senate, if I turned it around, you'd see Ted Cruz has signed it, among others, was a very threatening letter to the port of Sassnitz, so the actual port, saying, we will sue you, dear port owner, out of existence if you continue to let this happen in your backyard. So this was 2019. And for the Fährhafen Sassnitz, it's the first time they've ever received a letter from a couple of US senators saying, we'll sue you out of existence. So they did, I mean, in my book, I wrote they were used to being on the edge of the Iron Curtain, but they hadn't seen something like this. And then, of course, the question politically is, who dictates the foreign policy of what is almost a semi-public authority, or in particular the private actors that are enrolled in this? And the short answer is, if you have the United States Department of Justice against you, really think twice. But this is how exactly private actors get enrolled in order to be part of a strategy that for us has a lot of questions that we need to answer. Whose norms are applied, with what interests, with what economic benefits. And the strategic objective of this particular tool is to make sure that, or let me say how it works. If you can use access to networks, so use companies as access, because you actually know more about where the data flows are happening. SWIFT is cited a lot. You know where the data is happening. That is a strategic tool for you. That's not just the private activities of a company. That is access to a network. If you can cut something off, a lot of these tools were born in the war against terror after the 9/11 attacks, because you cannot fight against the country, but you can cut people off of the financial flow. So you need banks to cut them off. So you make sure that people can enter or not an economic network, and that's something that companies, private actors provide. Visibility over activities, financial flows, data is another one, and even market reach. If your companies are abroad in certain areas where that may be relevant because, I don't know, there are tourists that you may want to cut off in the future or get visibility over, even just getting your companies out there is of strategic interest. And then these companies become the site of interstate conflict. It's a dangerous world out for them because they're not just doing some sort of bottom line business thing. They are doing things in a context where they're of interest to their government. I'll get into that in a second. And so I have 3 stories about how access is used as companies, as where you want to create a choke point. So you basically you cut access off because you are able to have companies align with you, or you get data. And there's a specific story I have to tell about the Huawei case, which I think this is mainly about. Or you even have just market reach, and that is a story I have about antitrust and Japan. That is actually a friendly and happy story, because a lot of Japanese companies paid a lot of money in specific set of cartel cases, and it wasn't understood as economic sanctions, but something that normatively the Japanese agreed was necessary because of the way in which antitrust law had been harmonized over several decades. And so the question is, at one point, is it a foreign country imposing itself? And then we should say sovereignty, get out of our backyard. Or at one point, do we actually start looking sectorally at the issues and change our norms? And that's something I'm interested in. The one example, which is not any one of these 3, the US wanted to get visibility of their financial activities, including of whether they're paying taxes or not. And the Swiss banking secret was the biggest obstacle to this, because you can just move money out of the site. And so at one point, the US, and here it's the IRS, so the Revenue Service and others, wanted to get visibility over financial activities in Switzerland, and Swiss banking secrecy was Swiss national law. They just said, not giving you the data is maybe criminal in your case, but breaking Swiss banking secrecy is a breach of Swiss law. So they had to negotiate, which laws do I break, mine or yours? A short story, you don't break US laws, you comply with them, but also because in Switzerland, part of the population said, okay, we have a normative clash here, so let's think this through hard. Are you really seriously saying that we should have money laundering as the main business model of Switzerland, including diamonds smuggled in toothpaste across boundaries and all these things we now hear about in the press? Or maybe do the US have a case that our banks are just terribly, opportunistic business model? Even though it might be legal, it's still wrong. So you get normative change because within a country, that friction, and this is why I say it's an irritant, gets take up. And then even though there is a battle over whether it's right or wrong and who says it and why is it the US investigating it, in that country, people will say, but we're on their side, they're right. Volkswagen should have never fiddled with their emissions. And so you get normative change that comes through some of these sectoral discussions, which I personally find interesting. Let me skip that. I just want to insist, and then maybe we can do things in the discussion. I want to insist on the fact that this is deeply disturbing for the governments that have companies that are becoming the target of US prosecution for two reasons. Because they're not in the driver's seat, they want to regain what I call here judicial sovereignty. If somebody's going after Volkswagen, it should be the German government. Now it's the economy, but back in the day, it was just who has judicial sovereignty. If somebody's going after BNP Paribas, it should be the French government. Why is this the US? Even more so. And if BNP Paribas, who we can't even get to pay their taxes, is now paying $9 billion to the US, why is that going into the US public chest? So there's also this, one Department of Justice head said, I want corporate criminal prosecution to be a moneymaker for the US government. I mean, they're not shy about this. This brings in fines that are being paid or settlements, and that's good. But why the other country's government? So you have a very important conundrum, which is to regain judicial sovereignty over your own companies and to address corporate malfeasance and not be accused of looking the other way. And so what happened in the last decade is that as the US was rolling out this toolkit, very powerful toolkit, a lot of countries adopted something similar. Because they wanted to be part of the game, they wanted to be able to collaborate with the US. They said, you're right in putting your finger on these cases, but we want to do it together. So in 2013, the United Kingdom introduced a deferred prosecution agreement as a tool, as a legal tool in bribery cases. Brazil invented something similar with a leniency agreement in 2014. Brazil is a fabulous case because those of you who are not Brazilian might not know about the amount of corruption that is tied to the Lava Jato scandal that basically shook all of Latin America. But part of this was also very linked to this US story. Brazil adopted it, Spain adopted it, France changed their entire legal system with something called a judicial agreement in the public interest, including a new court for financial prosecutions. Mexico, Argentina, Canada, Japan, Peru, Singapore, a lot of them got inspired by these negotiation tools that allow you to bring a case and to actually shed light on something that previously was in the dark. And that changed independent of the legal family the countries were from. With one exception, Germany, I'll get to that in a second. But whether you have common law countries or civil law countries like Brazil and France, the introduction of what is called abbreviated criminal trials, the introduction of corporate criminal liability. So the idea, can a company be liable for something? Is a company actually an actor in a crime? Changed. In many of these countries, the agreement, the tool came in and the nature of the change was varied enough for me to say it's not just Americanization, it's very specific national responses. But the overall direction of this change is that we move towards more and more negotiated corporate justice and much less this belief that you can actually bring a company or their management to court for something they've done wrong. That, and that's my conclusion, is something we need to understand because it's a political issue, it's a geopolitical issue. The picture I showed you here in one of these slides of the European Commission was a picture of the commissioner who wanted to say, this is the US trying to do something that we in Europe don't agree with, and we will build an anti-coercive instrument to push back against it. So that it became a political move to say we have to ramp up our forces against the Americans. The French do this as well. The French Foreign Office has a whole department now linked to what they call lawfare, where they look at these cases and they say, we want to know, is it politically motivated or is there something that we actually agree with as a legal issue? And we want to protect our companies for being the innocent victims of an assault that may not be right or wrong, but actually be about economic or security interests. There's a lot of discussions of this, so I don't even use the word lawfare anymore because lawfare seems to excuse the case at hand, and I don't. A lot of these cases are real cases with immense fraud, immense corruption, immense environmental pollution or something else. But you still have to ask, why is this case prosecuted and not the other one? And if the answer is linked to nationality, then it's something that I think we should consider as problematic. Now, it's important for us to think through what it means to have negotiated corporate justice, because the good part, normatively speaking, about this is companies don't get away with some of their doubtful activities, no matter where they are in global markets. And that is something that's long been asked for, so that's good. But if they no longer get away from it because of something that is very much negotiated. And by the way, companies find this completely nerve-wracking because they just don't know what will hit them. It could be anything. It's not, I mean, the simple way is to say, just don't break laws. But the amount of laws you can possibly break if you're in a corporate activity of whatever sector is endless. So this is something that it sits over them like a Damocles sword. But still, if you are at one point in these legal battles, it is also true that negotiation is something we know in research is very much dependent on the negotiation situation. Power makes a difference. Big companies don't negotiate like small companies. Sectors that are relevant don't negotiate like companies from sectors that are not, et cetera, et cetera. And if we accept that you can negotiate whether something was right or wrong, we really need to pay attention to the parameters of this power game. And we should, because certain companies are more special than others. And here I just summarize it by saying platform companies. If you're a platform company and you provide a service that is not just of interest to your clients, but also to the government, like data, like finances, so financial institutions, the GAFAM, all the big data companies. The government has an interest in having you develop as this big octopus that goes into the world and will not strike you down, simply because their own security, their national security depends on it. And that means they can always negotiate better than somebody who just produces envelopes with a little window in the middle so you can see the address on the other side. So we really have to understand these power dynamics that come through what companies provide in the global economy in a very geopolitical world. And if we don't, what I think is also at stake, and I'll end on this, is the sense that really, you know, democracy, we always say democracy is at risk, but what we talk about is a lot of different things. We talk about elections, voting. I'm sure you're part of the discussion, but we also talk about rule of law and the idea that the law applies to everybody equally. Now, if there's this sense that if you're a big corporation, you just pay 9 billion and make it go away, and in a deferred prosecution settlement, that's exactly what's happening because you're not even guilty, and somebody else does something minor and will be locked up in prison, there's this feeling that the world is not turning right, even though you might be happy that companies can be embroiled in legal battles where previously they were not. But I think getting this right and getting a sense that this is fair and this is helping is very important also for political systems. So I'll end on that, but I have skipped over many points, so I'm looking forward to having your questions to get me back to it. Thank you. What's the best way of answering, individually or should I collect? Okay, thank you, because you give me the opportunity to speak about the EU. Let me reformulate your question, also for those that haven't heard you, since I have the mic. I've told you a story about the US, and one question is, doesn't the EU do the same? In particular, since in competition policy, we can see it use a really big stick as well and slap some companies over the head. I'm exaggerating, but somehow that's one part of the question, and one is that a reaction? So I think that's very interesting, and to me, that has always been a bit of a shadow case. I have a colleague, Chase Foster, who's actually done research comparing it, but if you want to compare it, you need to be very precise. The use of competition policy as a tool against companies in the US and in the EU, and there's very good competition policy expertise on this. And the answer they provide by studying this, and Chase Foster provides, is yes, the EU also uses its competition policy competences to go after companies with sometimes very considerable fines, as does the US. And what we see currently is that the way the EU is doing it is much more bureaucratic. It's much more hooked to things that normatively I think are useful. So penalty, there's basically a rule book of what the penalty should be with respect to the crime or the gain of the crime, etc. And it is done by a bureaucracy, the European Commission, rather than politically elected prosecutors of a branch, even though that's independent of government, that are a bit more political. And outcome is that you see foreign companies and European companies being subject to competition rulings, but there is not the same bias I've showed you in the beginning. The bias is much greater in what the US does in just competition policy, which is this home market bias, more on the foreigners, less on the domestic companies. That's my first indication, but certainly something worth going into. Now, the interesting thing about the EU is that the EU has this very big stick and it's competition policy, but that's its only stick. It only has competition policy. It doesn't have criminal competences at all. The EU just created a European Prosecutor's Office for the investigation of financial crimes of basically misused EU budget. Let me just tell you, the misused EU budget is this big compared to what we're talking about in all these other cases. So we only have the beginning of a tool of actually doing corporate criminal investigations or prosecutions at the EU level, because the competence for corporate criminal investigations is national. So we come to what you just said. We have 27 different regimes of how to do that. And even if Germany, I didn't say it specifically, but Germany is the outlier. Germany has not adapted to anything and is refusing to change, for good or for bad. But Germany has just resisted this pressure. Even if, let's say France, even if France wanted to say, we as a European nation should do something similar and use law in order to get at the companies that want to be in our market, it would have a hard time getting all the other countries on board if it's not through the European prosecutor, which is in its baby shoes right now. What they have done is this anti-coercion instrument I showed you was the first Ursula von der Leyen Commission's answer to the threat they perceived from the US. And it basically went like this. We have a company that is prosecuted by the US and might be condemned to pay, convicted to pay 5 billion. We then use our competition policy and hit it over the head so that there is no flawed competition. So basically they go through competition policy in order to go against corporate criminal fines. I mean, I'm being a bit too flippant here, but let me just say that if you're the CEO of a company and you're threatened to possibly pay 8 billion and the commission is behind you saying, but we will get you back through competition rulings, it's not reassuring, because in the space of time that this might take to happen, you're bankrupt or you're already dead or you're out of business. And that's where this negotiation comes from. If you actually make companies go to court and pay a fine, what's really in line is also their economic viability. So it doesn't have very big teeth. And that's why, I mean, it's there, people work on it, but I don't think the EU is comparable to what the US can currently do. China certainly has tried to put more and more legislation in place to also apply it extraterritorially. So everybody is now using that and what's the word, arming up. But the move really came from the US.
Great. Let me also ask a question about Schularick, Kiel Institute. So first of all, thank you for the fantastic talk. I learned a lot, and as you're right, there's so many layers in this, and I'm trying to think. So there's clearly that angle of geoeconomics in here, where you extraterritorial apply your rules and you use your market power to get companies in line, and then they have a choice. Do I no longer have business with the US, or okay, I'm going to comply because in case of that, I don't need to sell the screw to Iran or whatever. I get that, and that's super interesting. I think super relevant. It's a channel that people in econ have not thought about much. But then there's this other angle, which is, why do we get all of these extra court settlement? Like, why is this negotiation happening this way? Why don't they not going through the regular court process? And I guess looking at Stefan and rule-based orders and Mr. Erhard, why would deviating from clear and transparent rules? And I'm going to ask the economist question: is this possibly efficient? Is this probably a solution to a problem that otherwise in the realm of law, especially of international law, with all its problems of jurisdictions and implementation, couldn't be solved otherwise?
Yes. So I don't know how to answer you as an economist, but the short answer is it happens because it works. Mm-hmm. And previously nobody was able to bring a case. So this is the solution to solving the problem that companies can escape legal settings within national boundaries where the economy was global. So you have two options. Either you have national domestic rule of law settings and global markets. 1980s, 1990s, the companies go global, law stays national, they're out of the reach. This happened because you can bring a case. you can bring the company to account. That's what all the supporters will say. You can get closure as well. The BP oil spill, so the Deepwater Horizon, I'm pretty sure you've seen the picture. You can understand why people want to bring closure to something that you might not be able to bring through other means. And I talked to some people, not in a systematic way, but who are victims of corporate crime. And by the way this is applied is also what type of corporate crime can you actually settle through these negotiated means. And Canada says you can never settle when there's bodily injury. So when people die, you have to bring it to court, for example. But that's not what happens in the US. They had an explosion in a mine and it was settled. And that means you have death of people and the families will never hear who's responsible. So the short answer to your question is this whole messy, disconcerting, unregulated thing happens because you can bring a case. And it's one step closer to having companies at least within the sphere of the law. But my second question is, okay, but at the price of which law, with which biases politically, and with which national interests wield it?
Yeah, my name is Benedict Schmal. I'm a senior researcher at Wilhelmina University of Technology, and I have a competition economics background. I was thinking of whether, when we talk about mergers, what we do a lot in Europe, whether we should think about an additional efficiency like national, national power, so to say. Because if you think, for example, of Siemens and Alstom, the mergers that have been denied, you would have had a much more powerful supplier of trains globally, right? And you have bigger threat points if you allow for mega companies in Europe to use as a weapon against other companies, against other countries. Sorry.
Yes, short answer is yes. As soon as you start looking at this global power politics picture, there is a political argument. Friedrich Merz formulated that even when he was in a conversation at the Hertie School. The European market can only be the relevant scale, because you can try to get into these discussions and also wield your power as a market, as a European market, only if you think at the European scale. But it's more difficult because we are 27. We have national markets. We have different competition authorities. We have different references. We have different politicians elected on different platforms. So it's just not that easy. But in that game, that's the only answer. So thank you for that question. And let me answer, are we moving into a global law sphere? And then also, should a prosecutor be able to prosecute foreign companies? Maybe let me start with that. The answer to that is, of course they should. If there are very, very good reasons. This is why all the legal scholars just get very itchy and nervous when I speak, because if you have any legal setting, you say who is part of the prescriptive jurisdiction. And I think it's totally normal and well justified to say to a company, you want to be listed on the US stock exchange, you have to apply our security, corruption, fraud, whatever legislation. That's normal. And it's also normal to say, if you are serving clients in our country and you failed them because you're polluting not just them or the environment, you should be able to prosecute them. But I'm not disputing that at all. The point I was trying to make is the way of establishing that nexus has been used more and more extensively and creatively in ways that we might question. So, for example, in the US, there's a question: if you have activities in one state and you prosecute them in another state, what's the reason for the state of New York to prosecute something in New Jersey? And one of the ways in which that is established is a thing that I find funny in name: mail and wire fraud. If it has gone through a letter sent or a mail sent across boundaries, you can make the argument that you should have competence over this. So that is precisely what's now used also in our cases. You didn't have anything to do neither with the markets, neither with the clients or the territory or something else, but you've settled in dollars. It's a settlement system argument, or you've written a Gmail, could get you into US jurisdiction. And it's when the link is so tenuous that I'm wondering about it. Another favorite case that I have about, anybody here a soccer fan? I hope. So my favorite corruption cases of all times is FIFA. I hope you know just how corrupt FIFA is. If you don't read books about it, it is fun. But of course, technically speaking, that's not corruption, Because corruption is usually when a private actor spends money so that the public actor makes a decision in their favor. And everything in FIFA is private, it's an association. So when the Department of Justice at one point wanted to get at FIFA, which they had linkages because there's a lot of things that were going through the US territory, but they wanted to get after the Mexican, the Latin American, the European, all the different parts of FIFA, they said, so corruption isn't going to do it for us. We will find racketeering and organized crime, pretty much what you use against the mafia. And they did. And they brought very good court cases. So I don't want to say it's a game. There's a lot of activities in FIFA that were really in need of being prosecuted. And they weren't prosecuted in Mexico, not in Latin America, but they were brought by the US. And then afterwards, when the light is shown on these criminal activities, then of course it became a case in all these other countries as well. Because once you know more and more about this, you cannot just stand and sit by. Volkswagen is not a case of the US against Volkswagen. Volkswagen is in legal battles in, I want to say, 26 different countries. And has to settle in 26 different countries now. And so it should, because it was criminal activity by most accounts, except for in Germany, which doesn't have corporate criminal activities. There it was a Ordnungswidrigkeit or something like this. But it's obviously always prosecuted by the national system, and it should. But the real question is, how do these mix and match? In legal concepts, usually in a legal setting, you have this concept that you cannot be convicted twice for the same crime. But in the international world, you can. If it's exactly the same activity, but you're tried in the UK and then you're tried again in the US does not prohibit double jeopardy. So you can be convicted in the UK and the US can convict you one more time for exactly the same thing. And that is really a problem. That means then everybody knows there is no protection against double jeopardy, so we might just as well not judge and wait for the US to judge, and then we apply double jeopardy in order to not expose somebody to be tried twice. Which means there's a real need to find a global corporate justice system, and I do think this is a step of moving there sector by sector, because today we agree, thanks to the UN and the OECD, on corruption, definitions, and ways of prosecuting. Today we agree on antitrust. We don't agree on sanctions. We don't agree on other parts. So the way to harmonize it and actually have a sectoral regime comes out of this carrot and stick approach that I describe here. But we're only halfway there. So I don't know enough about OpenAI to give you a detailed answer. It's a question of intellectual property, and of course that's a case that will be brought, and there will be either regulation or court cases to clarify what exactly company that is basing its AI services on work that is produced by other people, seen or unseen, is bound to create frictions, and I think will at one point become the target of something. What I can say about the second part of your question, how likely is it that we will see that and see that quickly, is that I do think that platform companies insulate themselves a little bit more from the national prosecution of, so in this case, the US, than if they were not, or if they, I mean, the challenge, let me say it with an example. There is a lot of very, very courageous prosecutors that want to get at corporate crime, and that have, even brought Microsoft back. They will try to get at Google, that will try to get at these companies, but it's just very hard to win that. And so to a certain degree, I'm saying it's easier to fight against a big corporate player who's abroad and not take all the political backlash for it and win a case and say, see, I'm being tough on corporate malfeasance, than it is to bring and win a case against Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, Tesla, you name it, whatever the company is. But that still doesn't mean it can't happen or it won't happen. We see some cases. They're just so much more difficult. And so it's a bit of a David against Goliath kind of setting for a US prosecutor. And I'm just trying to explain that that also creates an incentive then to maybe go at cases that are a little bit less difficult to win. And there's a US author and a prosecutor who's working in the state of New York. He says the prosecutors have turned into this chicken shit club. They don't go at what we really are selected in the profession to do, and that is going at big corporate crimes. So my argument is just it's more difficult. That doesn't mean it won't happen. And I certainly think in the intellectual property issues you just pointed your finger at, something is bound to happen. But I don't know when and how, and I hope the people who take up the fight will win. So it's an invitation to do tea leaf reading. That's exactly what my answer will be, but I'm happy to go along. I mean, to a certain degree, I made you aware of the Trump government bump you saw there, because I wanted to show you a very sharp tool in the shed of the Department of Justice or the US government in international markets that Trump didn't want to use. He is so hung up on tariffs, hike tariffs, hit everybody over the head, strike a deal, that this type of thing is just not his kind of beauty. And so I actually do not think that this will be used as much as it could have under democratic government, which is not even an accusation. It's just he focuses so much on the big tariff signals that these smaller elements are less important for him. The other thing that I think is, yes, that means, first of all, we're moving into a more fractured world where we can be rightly afraid of trade wars, hikes, and protectionism, and that means you're already discoupling from markets that people that can then not entice you as much to want to stay in. Is that an opportunity for us? Let me say it politically. It does mean, I mean, to a certain degree, I sometimes describe this with the reference to the work of my two friends who talk about the US global economy as an underground empire. And it goes so far as to saying it's a country that didn't want to build a colonial empire, has an economic network that they can still use in a way to further their interest through it, through basically infrastructure and these tools. But I do think that we're moving to a world where that's decreasing, that space is decreasing. And that means others have to take up political responsibility for the remaining parts of the world that are left. I mean, the Chinese are building their own empire. The Europeans keep saying we have to make the European market the center of our attention. Will they succeed in doing this? That depends on political leadership, politics, and how do we deal with 27 different opinions on any question we have. Yes, yes, the answer is yes. And that's what I find, that's what to me is the most interesting part, because I'm interested in how does politics change? How do regimes change? How does multilateral agreement on something change? And let me move from CBAM back to corruption. There's such a thing as the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, which was the basis of prosecution of a lot of companies everywhere in the world for corruption. And that was used in a very aggressive way against foreign companies, domestic companies. And at the same time, there was negotiations on a multilateral regime in OECD and the UN. And one very nice article also by Abe Newman shows if you are from a company whose company was from a country whose company was targeted, you were much more likely to not just agree, but also ratify and implement the multilateral regime. So you get a lot of push towards more multilateralism with reasons that are norm acceptance and sincere norm acceptance in a context of constraint. So to a certain degree, it's a story about coercion and normative change going hand in hand. And I think it's too easy to just say we are forced to fight corruption because of the Americans. I think today a lot of countries say it's a very good thing that we think about corruption the way we do and we try to fight it and that we're moving towards something, or about antitrust or about something else. But you still have to understand the political context of coercion that is behind it. And you have to understand in certain cases that means you're harmonizing on the basis of norms which are not yours and which may create other frictions. And that can be good or it can be bad. I'm actually relatively neutral on it. I think the world is a better place when we have normative, when we have that friction, we deal with it, we discuss it, rather than then retreating into we do the environmental protection, you don't. So I think it's a good trigger for change. But that doesn't mean that the norms don't have ownership, and we should be aware of that.
Thank you.
That's accurate. The economically powerful have a greater play, and that's kind of the argument I want to convince you of, because it's to a certain degree that's news to some people, but you formulated it quite well. I made an argument about the US and the specific legal case. I could make an argument about Europe. The European story is slightly different. It's told quite well in Anu Bradford's Brussels Effect book. Brussels and Europe imposes itself in world markets by setting regulatory standards that for good or for bad become a norm and are adopted in a lot of other countries because they want to have access to the European market. And that's also a way of, empire, if you will. It's a different one, it's a regulatory empire or whatever. It doesn't go through the same carrots and sticks It's more free because you're free to adopt or not to adopt, but it's still a way of using the market in order to shape norms in the economy, but also in society based on the market power and reach you have. And the US and Europe are not the only one. I can tell you a story about China. I can tell you a story about other places in the world trying to do the same thing, but you have to have market power. I would say Turkey has some market power, but depends over whom you're asking me and with whom they're playing. So cloud power, that's something that a lot of European policymakers are very concerned about, and they call it digital sovereignty, and they say we have to build our digital sovereignty back. And I think the very short answer I can give you, and yes, you absolutely have to do that. Currently not the case, also not very promising that we will get it back in speed, politically speaking now that is sufficient, but at least it's something people should try. There's a German version to this attempt, let's say, anchored in a lot of things in Heilbronn. There is a French version to this around Mistral. We don't know how much Microsoft in it. If you get into the details, it's really interesting, but the political necessity to build digital sovereignty, I think, is very important. And I'll just give you one example that just kicked me off a chair. That is not just even regular public affairs, but intelligence. Where do you store your intelligence data? I mean, the really, really dark, deep secrets that kill the people and risk lives. And MI5 decided on an Amazon Web Service, and they built it specifically for MI5. And I think that's okay, but it means you're basically, I mean, you're not even being shy about the fact that all your intelligence really is US intelligence, and you have nothing to hide. Yeah. Because if you do, you wouldn't do this kind of thing, which by the way is fine. I'm all for intelligence cooperation, and I can say all terrorist attacks in Germany were prevented thanks to, I think, Morocco really, and a lot of other countries, which thankfully we share intelligence with. But if it goes through as much as the infrastructure, you really need to make sure you do that with your friends and your very close family members. Thank you.